Today the idea is to work in a reverse method, to start building up the lighter tones, whereas usually in a drawing you start with a white page and you build up the darker tones. In this exercise we're looking for the lighter areas. Before you all go into a panic thinking you don't have a white pen, I've got some alternative methods later on because it's quite important that you learn to build up lighter tones as well as darker tones. So I've started by sketching the shell, as I've done several times before. I have two white pens that I'm using. I've got a white marker and a gel pen. One of the alternatives at this point is to use a silver or gold gel pen. It doesn't necessarily need to be white. However, if you get a chance to do so, it's worth investing in a white pen. I buy mine from Amazon. They're actually quite hard to acquire, but they're really useful for sketchbooks and for adding highlights to drawings when you've done a pencil observational drawing. It's worth using it just at the end to pick up the highlights and add the finishing touches. The tricky thing is with this method is getting used to looking for those light highlights. You're so used to now looking for the dark areas, for the shadow and for the shade, and this time you're actually doing the opposite. When it comes to the marks I'm making with a white pen, I'm using quite a range. I'm using hatching, which is parallel lines. I'm using stippling, which is dots. I'm using bracelet shading, which is using lines that shape, so they're curving around the form. I'm actually shading in areas. At this point, I'm adding some of the darker tones on the top, so you don't have to just stick with the light tones. You can work back in some of the detail and some of the dark tones. So I've got a fine liner and I'm working over the top of the white. I'm dotting between each of the pens as well. So for this method you need some kind of dark surface and you need a light tool to work with. Actually there is an alternative to that I'll talk about later on. So you could be using paint. You could be using a white paint if you happen to have that onto a darker surface. You might even have to paint up your dark surface first to be able to use the white paint over the top. You can use white coloured pencils on black. If you use a rough paint surface, for example something like a ready mix, a gouache, a black watercolour, you can actually use white coloured pencil over the top of that. Another possibility would be to use white chalk onto a black surface, or black wax crayon onto a shinier white surface can be scratched away with a sharp tool to achieve a similar effect. By trying all the methods I've suggested there, you'd be adding to your assessment objective 2 for your GCSE by experimenting with different media and techniques to find the one that worked best, so it's worth experimenting for yourself. The last method I'm going to talk about is the reduction technique. You start by shading in the page with either charcoal or graphite, which is pencil, and then use a rubber to take away the highlights, the light areas. Here's an example showing something a student's done, taking away the light areas to show the highlights. Remember not to press too hard, and you can work back in with the pencil or the charcoal as you go. So your challenge this week is to find the most appropriate method of picking up the light highlights onto a dark surface.